Welcome to the HistoryMaps podcast.
It is really great to be here.
So today we are going to do a deep dive into a period of history that is, well, it's visually stunning, but tactically it's kind of baffling when you first look at it. We are going back to the late 18th and early 19th centuries. You know, the era of Napoleon.
Right, yeah, a time of really colorful uniforms, those tall shakos, and just fields of black powder smoke.
Exactly. And just to set the stage for everyone listening, this is specifically kicking off a brand new series today. This is going to be part one of a multi-part deep dive into Napoleonic tactics. And for this first one, we are focusing exclusively on the infantry.
The foot soldiers.
Yeah, the foot soldiers.
Yeah.
The absolute backbone of the army.
They really were. I mean, the infantry were the engine of warfare in this period. The cavalry had all the glamour, obviously, and the artillery made all the noise. But the infantry, they did the dying, and they did the holding of the ground.
But here's a thing that always trips me up when I'm watching movies or looking at paintings from this era. The way they fought just seems, it seems suicidal.
It does. It really does to modernize.
You have these massive lines of men, and they're wearing bright reds and bright blues. There's absolutely no camouflage at all, and they are standing shoulder to shoulder, completely out in the open.
Right.
And they were just standing there while people shoot cannons and muskets right at them. It looks like they're just waiting to be killed. So I guess the mission for this deep dive is to understand why. Why did they fight like that? Was it just some outdated tradition? Was it stupidity? Or, was there actually a method to the madness?
There was definitely a method. It wasn't stupidity at all. We are going to look at what I like to call the rock, paper, scissors of the Napoleonic battlefield.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, to understand it, we have to really strip it down to the absolute basics. We need to look at the weapons they were holding in their hands because the tool dictates the tactic. Then we need to look at the geometry of the formations they used to survive. And finally, we need to look at the psychology.
What makes a human being stand still in a literal storm of lead?
Exactly.
And we have a ton of material to get through for this. We're pulling from military history analysis, transcripts on visual tactics, and actual historical records from the era.
Yeah.
We're synthesizing all these sources to get a clear picture.
It is a really fascinating puzzle once you start putting all those pieces together.
Okay, so let's start with the hardware, the constraint of the weapon itself. If I am, say, a French conscript in 1805 or a British regular, what exactly are you putting in my hands?
You are holding a smoothbore flintlock musket.
Okay.
For the French, that is usually the 1777 Charleville model. For the British, it is the famous Brown Bess. But honestly, the specific model matters a lot less than the general characteristics of the weapon.
Because when you say musket, I think a lot of us picture something like a modern rifle, just an older wooden version of it. But that is not really accurate, is it?
Not at all. The very first thing you would notice if I actually handed you one of these is the sheer size and the weight of the thing.
They were heavy.
Very heavy, very robust weapons. And the caliber, which is the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, was massive compared to modern standards.
How big are we talking here?
Well, we are talking about a bore diameter of anywhere from 17.7 millimeters to 19.3 millimeters.
Wow.
To put that in perspective for you, a modern assault rifle fires a bullet that is maybe 5.56 millimeters wide.
Oh, wow. So a Napoleonic musket ball is huge.
It is huge. It is basically a heavy lead sphere. It is almost the size of a marble or a really large grape.
A lead grape. That sounds incredibly destructive.
Oh, it was devastating. When that lead ball hit a human bone, it didn't just break the bone cleanly like a modern bullet might, it completely shattered it. But the trade-off for all that destructive power was the delivery system itself. The key word you used earlier was smoothbore.
Right, meaning the inside of the barrel is just a smooth metal tube.
Exactly. There is no rifling, there are no grooves cut into the metal to spin the bullet.
Which is what modern guns have.
Right. In a modern gun, or even if you think about a quarterback throwing a football, the spin stabilizes the projectile. It makes it fly straight through the air. But a musket ball doesn't spin, it tumbles.
So it's kind of like throwing a knuckleball in baseball.
That is a perfect analogy. It is a knuckleball every single time, and it actually gets worse. To load these guns quickly in the middle of combat, the lead ball had to be slightly smaller than the inside of the barrel itself.
So it wasn't a tight fit.
No, if it was a tight fit, you would never be able to get it down to the bottom, especially once the gun got dirty from the black powder.
So there is a gap between the bullet and the barrel walls.
Yes, and that gap is called windage.
Windage, okay.
Think of it like rolling a marble down a drain pipe that is just a little bit too wide for it.
It bounces.
Exactly. As the gunpowder explodes at the bottom and pushes the ball out, the lead ball is physically bouncing around inside the barrel. It is rattling back and forth. And the very last place it hits the side of the barrel before it leaves the muzzle that determines which way it's going to go.
So you could be aiming dead center at a guy's chest.
And the ball might bounce off the left side of the barrel lip and fly 3 feet to the right.
Wow.
Or it could go straight into the dirt. Or sail right over his head. You also have to consider the lack of muzzle velocity compared to today.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for the soldier.
It effectively capped the range of the weapon, the effective range for a musket. And by that I mean the range at which you could reliably point it at a man-sized target and expect to hit it was only about 50 to 70 yards.
50 to 70 yards.
Which is roughly 46 to 64 meters.
That is nothing. That is like half a football field.
It is terrifyingly close. At that distance, you are close enough to clearly see the facial expressions of the enemy soldiers. You can literally see if the guy pointing a gun at you shaved that morning.
And beyond that 70-yard range.
Beyond that, it was pure luck. There were tests done later by historians where they fired these exact muskets at a target the size of a barn door from 200 yards away, and they missed the barn door most of the time.
Okay, so not only is the gun heavy, and not only can it not shoot straight, but I have also read about the reliability issues in the sources. These things didn't always go bang when you pulled the trigger, did they?
No, they certainly didn't. You have a piece of flint hitting a piece of steel to create a spark.
Right.
That spark has to fall perfectly into a tiny pan of gunpowder on the side of the gun, which then ignites, and that flash has to travel through a tiny hole to ignite the main powder charge inside the barrel.
That is a lot of steps that have to go right in a fraction of a second.
There are a lot of points of failure there.
So what kind of failure rate are we looking at in these historical records?
The sources suggest that about 1 in 6 shots was a complete misfire.
1 in 6. That is a massive failure rate for a piece of military equipment.
Now imagine the stress of that. You are standing 50 yards from people who actively want to kill you. You go through this whole grueling reloading process. You level your musket, you brace yourself, you pull the trigger, and click.
Nothing.
Nothing happens. Maybe the flint was worn out or chipped. Maybe the powder in the pan got damp from the humidity.
Yeah.
Or maybe the touch hole was just clogged with black powder soot.
This brings up a really obvious question for me, and I think for anyone listening. We know that rifles existed back then. We see them in the history books. The British had the 95th Rifles, famously. The Austrians had the Jaeger units.
Right, the specialists.
If rifles were accurate, if they had that spin, we talked about why on earth did armies equip 90% of their men with these terrible smoothbore muskets? Why not just give everyone a rifle and solve the accuracy problem?
Yeah. It is a great logic puzzle, isn't it? From a modern perspective, it seems like an absolute no-brainer. But you really have to look at the trade-offs they were facing. The first one is cost. Sure, rifles were a lot more expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. But the real killer, the main reason they didn't use them for everyone, was the rate of fire.
Because they were harder to load.
Much harder. Remember the concept of windage we just discussed?
The gap between the bullet and the barrel.
Right. The whole reason smoothbores had that loose fit was for speed. You could just drop the ball in and ram it down quickly. But with a rifle, the bullet physically has to grip those spiral grooves inside the barrel in order to spin.
Oh, so it has to be a perfectly tight fit.
Exactly. It has to be a very, very tight fit.
So you can't just drop it down the barrel?
No, you have to force it down. There is actually a great study in the sources by a military history analyst named Gene who looked deeply into this specific issue. He noted that early riflemen often had to carry a small mallet, a literal wooden hammer.
Wait, you are kidding. They had to hammer the bullet into the gun.
They did. They would place the ball on the muzzle, put the ramrod over it, and literally pound the ramrod with a mallet to force the ball down into the grooves of the barrel.
That is wild.
Or they had to use immense physical arm strength to shove it down. Now, imagine doing that physical exertion after you have already fired 10 shots. Because black powder is incredibly dirty stuff, it leaves this thick, greasy, hard residue inside the barrel called fouling.
And in a rifle, that fouling would clog up those little spiral grooves almost immediately, wouldn't it?
Exactly. So the more you shoot, the harder it gets to reload. After just a few minutes of intense firing, a rifleman might be struggling and straining for a full minute or two just to force one single bullet down his weapon.
Meanwhile, the guy across the field with the loose-fitting smoothbore musket has fired 3 or 4 times at him.
Right, so quantity essentially has a quality all its own.
That is the perfect way to put it.
In a massive battle with 100,000 men on the field, the raw volume of fire mattered far more than individual marksmanship. You needed to put as much lead into the air as humanly possible, as fast as possible. That is exactly why the smoothbore remained the standard weapon for the line infantry. Rifles were reserved for specialist light infantry guys who could take cover and take their time. But for the main army, speed was everything.
Let's talk about that speed, or I guess the lack of it. Because loading a smoothbore musket wasn't just a simple matter of putting a bullet in and shooting, it was a whole complex dance routine.
It really was. It was a complex industrial process performed by human hands under extreme duress. Depending on which nation's military manual you look at, there were anywhere from 12 to 17 distinct, separate steps just to reload one musket.
Walk us through it. What does a soldier actually have to do to get this gun to fire?
Okay, so first, the soldier reaches down into the heavy leather pouch on his hip and grabs a cartridge. This is a paper tube that holds pre-measured gunpowder and the lead ball.
Okay, got the paper tube.
He brings it to his mouth and physically bites the top off the paper.
Casing the gunpowder, I assume?
Yes, very salty, very unpleasant. Then he pours a tiny little bit of that powder into the priming pan on the side of the lock. He shuts the pan to keep the powder in place. Then he turns the entire gun upright and pours the rest of the powder from the paper tube directly down the muzzle of the barrel.
Still holding the paper in the hole.
Right. Then he stuffs the actual lead ball along with the paper, which acts as wadding to keep it somewhat tight into the top of the barrel.
Okay.
Then he has to draw his ramrod, which is this long metal stick housed under the barrel. He pulls it out, flips it around, inserts it into the muzzle, and rams the ball all the way down to the bottom. He has to pack it tight against the powder.
And then take the stick back out.
Yes. He pulls the ramrod out, flips it again, and slides it back into its slot under the barrel. This is a critical step because in the panic of battle, soldiers would sometimes forget to remove the ramrod and would actually shoot their ramrod at the enemy.
Meaning they can't reload ever again.
Exactly. Their gun becomes a very heavy club. So once the ramrod is away, he lifts the heavy musket back up, pulls back the hammer to the full cock position, levels the weapon, and finally he is ready to fire.
That is just exhausting to listen to.
Now, I want you to imagine doing all of those 17 steps while people are screaming all around you, while cannons are exploding, and while the man standing right next to you just got torn in half by artillery fire.
And how fast were they theoretically expected to do this whole process?
On a completely flat parade ground with no one shooting at him, a highly trained regular soldier could maybe do this 4 times a minute. Maybe 5 or 6 times if he was an absolute machine.
But in actual combat.
In actual combat, with the adrenaline shaking your hands, with the thick smoke choking your lungs, and the sheer terror of the situation, it was realistically more like 2 or 3 shots a minute.
And I assume that rate of fire only slows down as the battle drags on into the afternoon.
Oh, significantly. The flints get dull and stop sparking, so they have to stop and change the flint. The metal barrel gets incredibly hot to the touch. The soldiers just get physically exhausted from the weight of the gun and the ramming. And that fouling we talked about builds up, so even the loose ball doesn't slide down as easily. By the 3rd hour of a major engagement, the rate of fire for a battalion would drop drastically.
So we have clearly established that the primary weapon of the era is incredibly short-ranged, completely inaccurate, very prone to misfiring, and agonizingly slow to reload.
That is the reality of the flintlock.
And this brings us directly to the main event of our deep dive, the tactics. Because everything you just described perfectly explains why they stood the way they did.
Yes. The tactical formation is the direct, logical solution to the physical limitations of the weapon.
This is what military historians call the close order, the shoulder-to-shoulder, rigid wall of men. Because my instinct, and I think any modern person's instinct when faced with gunfire, is to say, hey, there's a guy shooting at me. I should probably go hide behind that tree over there. Or I should lie down flat in the tall grass.
Which is exactly what every infantryman does today.
Right. But the sources are clear.
Yeah.
If you did that in 1805, you would lose the battle immediately. Why?
There are 3 main reasons for this. The first reason is simply command and control. We really have to remember the era we are in. There are no radios, there are no walkie-talkies, there are no drones giving generals an overhead view of the battlefield.
It is entirely reliant on the human voice and eyesight.
Exactly. And the phrase fog of war was not a metaphor in the Napoleonic era. It was literal. We mentioned the black powder smoke earlier. When thousands of muskets go off at once, they create this incredibly thick, heavy, white, sulfurous cloud. It just hangs in the air.
It doesn't blow away.
Not if there is no wind. There are primary accounts of battles where soldiers literally could not see the sun at high noon because the smoke was so dense.
Wow. So if everyone scatters to go hide behind trees and rocks like modern soldiers?
The commander has completely lost his army. He can't see them through the smoke. They can't hear his orders. He has no way to tell them to advance or shift left or retreat. To move 500 men as a cohesive unit in that environment, you need them physically touching each other, condensed into a solid block. That way, they can hear the drum beats right next to them, and they can look up and see the regimental flag above the smoke.
That makes total sense. If you lose control of the men, you lose the army. What is the second reason for the tight formations?
The second reason is the firepower math we touched on earlier. Since individual muskets are totally inaccurate, aiming at a specific person at 60 yards is basically pointless.
Because the windage will just send the ball wherever it wants.
Right. So the only way to guarantee hits on the enemy is to turn your entire battalion into a giant shotgun.
Volley fire.
Yes, volley fire. You absolutely do not want scattered individual firing. You want 500 men pulling the trigger at the exact same split second. That sends a massive, dense wave of lead flying across the field. Even if every single individual shot is completely inaccurate, the overall cone of fire covers the general area of the enemy formation. Someone is going to get hit.
And the British doctrine was heavily focused on this, right? Holding fire to maximize the impact.
Yes, holding fire until the last possible second. But to make volley fire work, you need density. You pack as many musket barrels as possible into the smallest possible frontage. If your men spread out, your firepower dilutes. And the enemy, who is packed tightly together, will just walk right over your scattered men.
Okay, so command and control and firepower math. And what is the third reason?
The third reason is the most human one of all: morale and coercion.
Coercion is a strong word to use for your own troops.
But it is absolutely necessary to understand the mindset. It goes against every instinct of human survival to stand perfectly still in an open field and let people shoot heavy lead balls at you. The biological urge to turn around and run away is overwhelming.
So the tight formation acts as a sort of psychological anchor for the men.
It is herd safety. If I am standing there and my shoulder is pressed against your shoulder on my left and another guy's shoulder on my right, I feel like I am part of a massive, unstoppable beast. I am not just one terrified kid named Pierre standing in a field. I am a vital piece of the 45th Regiment of the line.
It keeps you grounded in reality. You aren't alone.
But there is a much darker side to this structure. The tight formation also physically allows the officers to police their own men.
Okay.
If you look at the layout of a line formation, the officers and the NCOs, the sergeants, they didn't stand in the very front row leading the men.
They didn't.
No, they stood at the back. They formed a rank behind the fighting men called the file closers.
To direct the volley fire.
To direct the fire, yes, but also to physically stop you from running away. These sergeants carried spontoons, or halberds, which are basically long wooden poles with nasty spearheads on the end.
Oh, wow.
If a soldier panicked and tried to drop his weapon and turn around to run, he would literally run right into his own sergeant's pike.
That is brutal. So you are completely trapped between the enemy's muskets in front of you and your own officer's spears behind you.
And it gets even more extreme. Behind the entire regiment, further back, there was often a specialized line of cavalry deployed. This was called the picket line. Their explicit job was to ride down and force back any soldier who managed to rout and run away from the battle line.
So it was a very brutal calculus. The only way out is forward.
Napoleon understood this psychology perfectly. He famously wrote, "Moral force, rather than numbers, decides victory." What he meant was that the army that holds its nerve the longest, the one that doesn't break and run, is the one that wins the battle. The close order formation was a machine explicitly designed to manufacture and enforce that nerve.
I really want to try and visualize this for a moment. We have talked about the cold mechanics, but let's talk about the sensory experience of the soldier. If we drop someone listening to this deep dive right into the middle of a line at a battle like Austerlitz or Waterloo, what are they actually experiencing in that moment?
It would be a total assault on the human senses. First of all, the noise. It is not just the deafening bangs of the muskets and the deep boom of the artillery. It is the constant, rhythmic, driving beat of the drums.
Because the drums were the radio.
Yeah. Yes, the drums told you what to do. The different beats meant march or halt or load. Then you have the screaming of the officers trying to be heard over the guns. And then, of course, the smoke.
The black powder smoke.
It would taste horrific. It tastes like rotten eggs because of the sulfur in the powder. It severely stings your eyes. You are incredibly thirsty because the stress dries your mouth. And biting those paper cartridges leaves salty, nasty gunpowder residue all over your tongue and teeth. Your face is entirely blackened with soot.
And the claustrophobia of the formation.
You are packed in incredibly tight. You can smell the sweat and the unwashed wool uniforms and the pure fear of the man pressed up next to you, and you are just waiting.
Waiting to fire.
Waiting to be told what to do. That is the worst part. You are standing there watching a solid blue or red wall of enemy soldiers moving steadily toward you. You see the bright flashes and puffs of smoke from their guns. You hear the terrifying whiz of lead balls flying past your head, or the sickening thud when one hits the man next to you, and you are not allowed to move. You are not allowed to duck. You just have to stand there, stare straight ahead, and trust the drill.
It really changes how you view those majestic oil paintings in the museums. It wasn't glorious at all. It was just a terrifying, grueling test of discipline.
Absolutely. It was endurance above all else.
Now, we have been using the word infantry pretty broadly so far.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources point out that not all foot soldiers were the exactly same. There were different jobs, different classifications, right?
Yes. By the time we get to the height of the Napoleonic era, you generally had two main flavors of infantry on the field: line infantry and light infantry.
I have heard them described in the analysis as the sledgehammer and the rapier.
That is a very accurate way to distinguish them. The line infantry, these were your fusiliers, your musketeers. They were the sledgehammer. They were the vast majority of the army. They fought in those rigid, tight, close-order formations we just spent time discussing. Their entire focus was discipline, marching in cadence, delivering massive volley fire, and holding the ground. They were the sheer mass of the army.
And the rapier.
That is the light infantry. The French called them chasseurs or voltigeurs. The Germans called them Jägers. The British had their rifles. These men fought in what was called open order.
So they were actually allowed to spread out.
Yes. They operated loosely, usually in pairs. They were specifically trained to use the natural terrain to their advantage. They would hide behind stone walls, crouch in ditches, or fire from behind trees.
So they fought a bit more like modern soldiers.
Exactly. Their job was to screen the main army, harass the enemy lines, and specifically pick off enemy officers and sergeants to disrupt their command. Because they weren't standing shoulder to shoulder under the direct gaze of a captain, light infantry needed a lot more personal initiative and intelligence. They had to think for themselves.
But the sources also mentioned that these distinct lines blurred quite a bit as the wars dragged on, right?
They did. Over 20 years of constant warfare, armies realized they needed maximum flexibility. So traditional line infantry were eventually trained to spread out and skirmish if the situation demanded it. And light infantry, who usually fought scattered, were trained to snap together and form tight lines if enemy cavalry suddenly appeared.
So the roles became interchangeable to an extent.
Yes, but the core distinction in their primary mindset and training remained.
Let's zoom in on the organizational unit itself, the battalion. The sources make it clear this was the basic tactical building block of the era.
It was. When Napoleon or Wellington looked at a map on a table, they didn't count individual men, they counted battalions. A French battalion, for example, on paper, was supposed to be about 840 men. But on an actual campaign, due to rampant sickness, desertion, and the exhaustion of marching across Europe, a fighting battalion was usually closer to 500 or 600 men.
And inside that battalion block of 600 men, you had specialized companies. I've always been really fascinated by the grenadiers.
The grenadiers were the absolute elite. They were the shock troops. Every single French battalion had one designated company of grenadiers. And to get into that specific company, you had to meet very strict physical requirements.
They had to be physically imposing.
You had to be tall, usually over 6 feet tall, which was exceptionally large for the diet and demographics of the early 1800s. You had to be broad-shouldered and strong. And to make them look even more terrifying to the enemy, they wore those massive, tall, bearskin caps.
All right, the furry hat. So you have a guy who is already 6 feet tall, and he is wearing an 18-inch bearskin hat on top of that. He must look like an absolute giant coming towards you through the battle smoke.
That was entirely the point. Pure psychological intimidation. The grenadiers were kept in reserve by the battalion commander and used to lead the toughest, most critical bayonet charges or to hold the most dangerous defensive positions when the line was breaking. They were the anchor.
And on the completely other end of the physical scale within that same battalion?
You had the voltigeurs.
The leapers.
Right, the vaulters are leapers. This was the dedicated light company attached organically to the battalion. These were deliberately the shortest men in the unit, often guys who were under 5'3" or 5'4".
So the total opposite of the grenadiers.
Yes, but they were specifically chosen for their agility, their foot speed, and their sharp intelligence. They were the ones sent out way in front of the battalion to skirmish in the open order.
So if you look at a single battalion, you have the giants on one side for the heavy smashing, the small, incredibly agile guys out front for the screening, and the regular fusiliers in the middle making up the bulk of the line.
Precisely. It was a self-contained, combined arms team operating within a single infantry unit.
Okay, so we have laid out all the pieces on the board. We know the weapons, the psychology, the types of soldiers. Now let's look at how they actually move those pieces, what the sources call the geometry of battle, because this is where that rock, paper, scissors dynamic really comes into play. They didn't just walk out and stand in one single straight line all day long.
No, absolutely not. A battalion commander had to constantly shift his 600 men into completely different geometric shapes depending on the immediate threats around them. It was a really high-stakes, incredibly stressful geometry problem played out in real time.
Let's start with the most basic one. Formation 1, the line.
The line is exactly what it sounds like. It is the standard firing formation. You take your 600 men and you stretch them out horizontally. The French typically deployed their men standing 3 ranks deep, so 3 rows of men. The British, famously, stretched their men even thinner, standing only 2 ranks deep.
The famous thin red line.
Exactly.
So why choose the line formation? What is the tactical benefit?
It gives you maximum possible firepower. If you are stretched out in a line, every single musket in your battalion has a clear line of sight to the enemy. You are bringing 100% of your available firepower to bear all at once. It also minimizes casualties from enemy artillery fire.
How does it do that?
Because the formation lacks depth. If the enemy fires a solid iron cannonball straight out of line, the ball might hit the front rank, kill the man behind him, and then fly harmlessly out the back of the formation. You only lose 2 or 3 men to that shot.
Okay, that makes sense, but it must be incredibly hard to move, right?
It is notoriously difficult. Imagine trying to get 600 people to walk in a perfectly straight line across a muddy, plowed farmer's field, stepping over wooden fences, pushing through bushes, without the line bending, bowing, or breaking apart. It takes immense amounts of drilling on the parade ground. Because if that line breaks, physical gaps open up in your wall of men, and you become extremely vulnerable.
And what is the absolute biggest vulnerability of the line formation?
The flanks. The extreme left and right ends of the line. A line is incredibly strong to its direct front. It is a literal wall of lead and fire, but on the sides, it is completely weak.
Because the men are facing forward?
Right. If enemy cavalry can ride around the sides rapidly and hit the end of the line, they can do what is called rolling it up. They smash into men who physically cannot turn their long muskets fast enough to shoot back because they are packed in tight facing the other way.
The sources provide a really vivid, terrifying narrative vignette of exactly this going wrong, the disaster at the Battle of Arcole.
Yes, that is a perfect example of the danger of the flank.
So set the scene for us. General Augereau's brigade is deployed out in a massive line.
Right, they are spread out for maximum firepower, but suddenly a violent rain squall hits the battlefield.
So we have that sensory overload issue again. High winds, driving rain.
Visibility drops to almost 0 instantly. The men in the line are completely blinded by the rain, and because of the loud noise of the storm and the thunder, they simply couldn't hear the hooves of the opposing cavalry approaching them. The enemy cavalry used the weather to maneuver completely around to the unprotected side of the French line.
And when the rain finally lifts,
the French infantry wipe their eyes, look to their side, and suddenly realize there are hundreds of hostile horsemen charging at full speed right at their exposed flank.
And they're stuck in a line formation.
They are in a line. They couldn't issue the complex orders to shift formation fast enough. The cavalry just smashed right into the end of the line like a battering ram. The sources say that in about 5 minutes of chaos, 3 entire infantry battalions were effectively destroyed.
That is just horrific. 3 battalions.
Yes, over 1,200 men were killed, wounded, or captured out of a total of 1,500. And it all happened simply because they were caught in the wrong geometric shape at the wrong time.
Okay, so if you are a commander and you know you need to move your men safely or you need to move them fast over broken ground, you clearly do not use a line.
No, you use formation 2, the column.
The battering ram.
Exactly. Think of the column formation kind of like a modern bus. It has a very narrow frontage, maybe only 40 or 50 men wide, but it is very, very deep. It might be 20, 30, or even 40 ranks deep.
What is the main advantage of bunching everyone up like that?
Pure maneuverability and speed. It is so much easier to get men to walk in a column. You basically just have to tell them to follow the backpack of the guy walking directly in front of them. It moves fast over bad ground, and it has tremendous shock value. If you are standing in a thin line and you see this massive, deep, solid block of shouting men running straight at you, it is terrifying. It carries immense physical and psychological momentum.
But surely the firepower math is terrible, right?
It is abysmal for firepower. If you have 600 men packed into a deep column, only the men in the very front 2 or 3 rows, maybe 40 guys total, can actually level their muskets and shoot at the enemy. The other 560 men are just walking behind them, unable to fire without hitting their own friends. So if a column decides to get into a stationary shooting match with a line, the column will lose every single time.
And then there is the Achilles heel of the column, the artillery problem.
The bowling ball effect.
Right. We talk about how cannonballs pass through a thin line, but if an iron cannonball hits the narrow front of a dense column,
it travels through the entire depth of the tightly packed formation. A single solid shot can physically tear through 10 or 15 ranks of men. It doesn't just kill 1 or 2 guys, it can kill or horribly maim 20 or 30 men in a fraction of a second. It just rips the absolute heart out of the unit.
that is a gruesome image. So the general has to constantly balance this calculus. He needs the column to move quickly, but he needs the line to actually shoot.
Yes, and the real skill of a Napoleonic general was switching between those shapes at the precise right moment. The standard tactical approach was to march your troops toward the enemy in column to get them close quickly, and then halt and deploy them outwards into a line to start the firefight.
But deploying from a column into a line takes time. You have hundreds of men shuffling outward.
It takes precious minutes, and if the enemy commander catches you right in the middle of that deployment while your men are stepping sideways, officers are shouting, and nobody is in position to fire, your battalion is doomed.
Okay, so we have line beats column in a shooting match. We have cavalry beats line by hitting the flanks. So what beats the cavalry?
That brings us to Formation 3, the square.
This one is exactly what it sounds like, isn't it?
It is literal geometry. The battalion commander orders the men to form a hollow rectangle or square. The men arrange themselves so they're facing outwards on all 4 sides, usually 4 to 6 ranks deep. The men in the very front row physically kneel down, plant the wooden butts of their muskets firmly into the dirt, and angle the sharp steel bayonets upward. The rows of men behind them remain standing, leveling their muskets to fire over the heads of the kneeling men.
It creates a human hedgehog.
It is a fortress of sharp steel. And here is the fundamental psychological truth about horses. They are not machines. They are living, breathing animals with a very strong biological instinct for self-preservation. You absolutely cannot force a horse to charge headfirst into a solid, stationary wall of sharp metal spikes. It will naturally swerve away at the last second, or it will just stop dead in its tracks.
So as long as the infantrymen in the square hold their nerve and don't run away, the cavalry literally cannot touch them.
Correct. The cavalrymen will ride furiously around and around the outside of the square. They will yell insults, they will fire short-range pistols into the match, they will do everything they can to scare the infantry into breaking formation, because the moment one side of the square panics and runs, the horses get inside, and it is a slaughter. But if the square holds firm, the cavalry is effectively helpless.
The Austrians actually had a slightly different variation of this, the sources note.
Yes, the battalion mass. It was essentially an incredibly dense, tightly packed column that just acted like a solid square. It was a bit cruder than the perfectly hollow French square, but it was highly effective for hastily trained conscripts who couldn't manage the complex drill of forming a hollow square under pressure.
But, again, going back to the rock, paper, scissors dynamic, every formation has a counter. What is the counter to the square?
Artillery. Artillery is the absolute bane of the square.
Because it's a densely packed target.
Exactly. A square is a dense, completely stationary target. It cannot move to dodge. If the enemy commander sees you form a square to defend against his cavalry, he just calmly brings up his cannons. He parks them at a safe distance and starts firing solid round shot or grape shot right into the center of that dense mass of men.
And the men in the square can't do anything about it.
They just have to stand there, shoulder to shoulder, and watch the cannons tear their friends apart. If they break the square to run from the cannons, the cavalry riding around them will immediately chop them down. So they have to just take the punishment. It was agonizing on a psychological level.
So, to recap the cycle, square beats cavalry. Artillery destroys the square.
Yeah.
Cavalry rolls at the line. The line outshoots the column. It is this constant, lethal cycle of shapes.
And the truly great generals of the era, commanders like Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington, they were the ones who could successfully force their opponent into the wrong shape.
Give me an example of that.
Well, you might aggressively threaten the enemy infantry with your cavalry, which forces them to quickly bunch up and form squares for protection. But that was just a trap, because you then bring up your hidden artillery and absolutely blast those squares to pieces. You dictate their geometry.
I want to make sure we mention one specific hybrid formation from the sources before we move on to the actual mechanics of combat, the mixed order.
Ah, yes, large mixed. This was famously Napoleon's favorite tactical deployment.
What does it involve?
It is a combination. He would take a brigade and put some of the battalions deployed in a wide line formation, and then place other battalions in deep column formations right next to them on the flanks.
Trying to get the best of both worlds.
Exactly that. The battalions in line provided that massive, sweeping volley firepower to the front. The battalions in column provided forward momentum, physical shock value, and crucially, they protected the weak flanks of the lines.
It sounds perfect in theory.
It was brilliant, but it was incredibly difficult to coordinate on the ground. It required exceptionally high levels of training and officer competence to keep those different shapes moving together without breaking apart. But when the French veterans executed it well, it offered both fire and shock, and it was incredibly hard for an enemy to stop.
Okay, so we have covered the weapons, the types of troops, and the geometric shapes they formed. Let's put all of this together into a flowing narrative of combat. How did an actual Napoleonic infantry battle unfold?
Yeah.
What happens when the drums start beating and the armies close in?
Usually the deadly dance begins with the skirmishers. We talked about the voltigeurs earlier. The commanders send them running out into the no man's land between the two main armies.
They form that screen, the swarm of gnats.
Yes. They spread out, using the terrain. They work in pairs. One man fires his musket while his partner reloads behind cover, so they are never both caught with empty weapons. Their job is to constantly harass the solid enemy line standing across the field. They want to annoy the enemy soldiers. They specifically aim for the officers to disrupt command, and most importantly, they try to provoke the enemy line into losing its temper and firing a massive volley early.
Why do they want the enemy to fire a volley at them? They are the ones who might get hit.
Because if an enemy battalion fires a massive synchronized volley at a few scattered skirmishers hiding behind rocks, they have just completely wasted their ammunition. And more importantly, now they have an empty gun. They have to go through those 17 steps to reload.
I see.
That 20 seconds where the enemy is frantically reloading is the exact moment your main heavy column launches its attack across the field. You catch them empty.
That is incredibly devious. So you are actively baiting them to shoot?
Exactly. So to counter this, the defending army is forced to send out their own stream of skirmishers to push your skirmishers back. It becomes this intense, loose battle before the main battle even starts.
Once that skirmish screen is cleared away and the main massive lines finally get within that deadly 60-yard range, we get the main firefight. We talked about volley fire being the goal, but I was reading in the analysis that the ultimate test of discipline was actually holding your fire.
Oh, absolutely. The British infantry were particularly famous across Europe for this exact tactic. They would endure enemy fire, letting the French march closer and closer, and they would wait until the enemy was shockingly close before firing.
How close?
Sometimes 30 yards, sometimes 20 yards, almost point-blank range for a massive formation. The psychological idea was that one single, utterly devastating, perfectly timed smash of lead would inflict so many casualties at once that it would break the enemy's morale instantly.
It is all about the shock value.
Yes. If you let your men fire individually whenever they wanted, it degraded into what they called running fire. Total chaos. Men firing at random, thick smoke everywhere, officers losing all control. The doctrine prioritized massive, controlled volume of fire over any kind of individual aiming.
Though the sources do mention the Russians tried to experiment with accuracy a bit, didn't they?
They did. Russian doctrine experimented with slightly angling the wooden stocks of the muskets to naturally improve the alignment of the barrel when a soldier leveled it. But even then, the core doctrine across all nations was that volume and control were far more important than precision.
And finally, if the skirmishing didn't break them and the devastating volley fire didn't settle the issue, you reach the absolute climax of the infantry battle, the bayonet charge.
Yes, the ultimate test of nerve.
Now, I have to say, when I picture a bayonet charge in my head, I picture the movies. I picture two massive armies running full tilt at each other, violently colliding in the middle of the field, and then just 5 or 10 minutes of brutal hand-to-hand stabbing, wrestling, and chaos.
And that is entirely the Hollywood version of history. The historical reality was very, very different.
The sources emphasize that it was mostly a psychological weapon, right?
Almost entirely psychological. And we actually have hard data from the era to prove this. We have medical reports from contemporary military surgeons, like the famous French surgeon Baron Larrey, who personally treated thousands of wounded men after these huge battles.
And what do the medical reports show?
They found incredibly few actual bayonet wounds. The vast majority of the wounds they treated were from musket bullets or artillery shrapnel.
So if they weren't physically stabbing each other on a large scale, what was actually happening during a bayonet charge?
It was essentially a massive, high-stakes game of chicken. It was a pure test of psychological will. One side forms up, lowers their muskets so the long steel bayonets are pointing straight ahead, and they march forward. They are screaming, the drums are beating the charge. They are trying to look as aggressively terrifying as humanly possible.
And the defenders?
The defending line just watches this wall of shiny metal points coming at them through the smoke.
And one side eventually blinks.
Exactly. Almost every single time, one side's nerve fails before the physical collision. Usually, the defending line becomes so utterly terrified by the sight of the approaching bayonets that they break formation and run away before the attackers ever reach them.
Oh.
Or the defending line stands incredibly firm, they don't panic, they wait until the charging attackers are 10 yards away, and they fire a massive point-blank volley right into their faces. And the attacking column just physically disintegrates from the gunfire and retreats.
So that dramatic moment of impact, the physical clash of steel on steel, it rarely occurred.
Very, very rarely. As the analysis notes, the moment of impact was almost a myth. One side's morale inevitably cracked before the physical contact happened. It goes right back to Napoleon's core philosophy. Moral force decides victory. The bayonet wasn't primarily a tool for stabbing people. It was a weapon of pure terror designed to force the enemy to run.
This has just been a massive amount of detailed information to digest today. We have gone all the way from the microscopic mechanics of a piece of flint hitting steel right up to the sweeping geometry and psychology of a battalion forming a defensive square.
It is a brilliantly complex system when you really look at it.
It is. And when you lay it all out like this, the underlying logic absolutely holds up. These soldiers stood in those rigid, colorful lines, not because they were stupid and not because their generals were just blindly following tradition. They stood like that because the severe limitations of their technology and the desperate need for command and control absolutely demanded it.
It was truly the only logical way to manage the sheer chaos of a black powder battlefield. They were doing the absolute best they could with the deeply flawed tools they were given.
Before we completely wrap up this first part of our series, I want to leave everyone listening with a final thought that really stuck with me while we were synthesizing all this research. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about how these rigid tactics, the close order lines, the dense columns, the massed volleys, were all a direct, logical result of the smoothbore musket's severe limitations.
Right. Inaccurate, short-range guns completely dictate that you must use massed formations.
But as the 19th century progressed after Napoleon, the technology began to change radically. The smoothbore was replaced by the rifled musket, which was much more accurate. Then came breech-loading rifles that you could load lying down, and then, eventually, early machine guns.
The military technology advanced incredibly rapidly during the Industrial Revolution.
But the military tactics didn't change with it. Generations of generals kept teaching and using these exact same Napoleonic close-order principles, marching men in tight lines, attacking in dense, upright waves long after the smoothbore musket was obsolete.
It is arguably the great tragedy of modern military history. You see the horrific results of this lag in doctrine during the American Civil War with events like Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, where men marched shoulder to shoulder into accurate rifle fire. And you see it on an even more catastrophic scale in the early battles of World War I. Generals were desperately trying to use Napoleonic infantry tactics against industrialized, rapid-fire weapons.
It really just shows how incredibly hard it is to change deeply entrenched institutional thinking. It took millions of senseless casualties from military commanders to finally realize that the era of the Napoleonic line was truly over.
It does. It proves the old adage that armies always prepare to fight the last war, not the war they are actually in.
Well, that is certainly a heavy and provocative thought to end on for today, but it is serious food for thought as we continue this series. This has been part one of our Napoleonic Tactics deep dive. We have extensively covered the infantry, the backbone of the army. Next time, we are going to shift gears completely and look at the glamour, the speed, and the shock. We are going to dive into the cavalry.
The eyes and the hammer of the Napoleonic army. I really can't wait to get into it.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.